Hi, everyone, and welcome back. So today I wanted to do an episode on poetry. And I can't believe it took me this long to get to the subject of poetry because I do love poetry, and that's how my first origins of writing was to write poems. So I've been writing poetry for quite some time now. Um, and I love poetry. So it took me a while to get here, but finally I'm here, and I wanted to share with you the reasons why I prefer traditional poetry and why I write in traditional poetry, which just means I use meter and rhyme in my poems. And I have written free verse, and once in a while I'll still write free verse. I'm not saying that I have anything really against free verse, but I just prefer to write in traditional poetry. So one of the reasons that I love traditional poetry is because of the meter and rhyme, because I feel like the meter and rhyme creates this extra dimension, this extra layer to poems. So in poetry, really what's important is not just the pretty, prosy, rosy language, right? That the personification, similes, the metaphors, the imagery, very important. And that's what free verse does really well, actually, because that's where it shines. That's the concentration of free verse. But traditional poetry, what it does is it adds that extra layer of the meter and the rhyme, which to me feels like music without the melody. So the beat of the meter and then the rhyming at the ends creates a song in my head without actually being a song. That's how I perceive it. And I think it's actually a lot easier to commit traditional poetry to memory because of that aspect, because it creates this rhythm and beat. And so I prefer traditional poetry because I feel like there's something about it in our human nature that gravitates towards song in general. We all love music, most of us at least. And I feel like you can catch people on the rhythm and the rhyme if you're not catching them on the imagery itself. Do you know what I mean? Or you could, capture them on the imagery, of course, and then the very fact that it has the rhythm and the rhyme, it kind of pushes it even further, and the person could really get captivated by such a combination of techniques. At least I do. Definitely I do. And because I find that people can memorize traditional poetry a little bit better than free verse, I find that people, whether they admit it or not, do kind of catch on to that meter and rhyme a little more than just words in prose, right? So that is one reason why I love traditional poetry. And another reason why I love traditional poetry is because I I love the challenge of writing it in meter and rhyme, because I feel like it ups your skill level. And I'm not saying you're not skillful if you write in free verse, because I think you actually need to have a lot of skill to captivate people with free verse poetry, because there is none of that rhythm and rhyme, and you kind of have to. Oh, look, my little friend came to visit the poetry segment. For those of you listening on the podcast, my bird just flew on my shoulder. Okay, give me a second. Let me put her back and I'll be right back. Okay, so traditional poetry, why I love it. Okay, so I love the challenge, like I started saying. I think that I really appreciate that it challenges me and it forces me to learn different ways I could create something meaningful with meter and rhyme. And it just ups my game every time I face a challenge and I wonder how I could put this in rhyme and meter. and it just forces me to utilize that creativity part. So I actually really appreciate that. I know that that is a big criticism of traditional poetry, that it's too constricting, and that the confines of trying to write it in meter and rhyme, it kind of is too much for some people. And I understand if it is too much and you want to explore free verse. I think that's important. I've definitely written free verse as well. I've explored that element, that technique. But I still really love mostly just getting into the challenge of being able to put my thought in meter and rhyme. So, and another reason why I really love traditional poetry, mostly I think because I'm a big history buff, and there a lot of traditional poetry, obviously the word traditional, historical poetry is in meter and rhyme. And I love that the times that, for example, Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin, the Russian writer, the Russian poet, you know, there's a romanticism that is involved in reading his poetry because of the time period, because of the confines of even their society, right? Because women and men were not integrated so much, and they had very little contact before marriage. So if there was a spark of falling in love or something, every little kind of hint to that in open society mattered. Every glance, every touch, every word. And I think that romance, the romanticism of it all, kind of allures me, and I gravitate towards that. I try to bring the beautiful aspects of history, not so much the negative parts of history. We could leave those behind and learn from them, but the really gentle, fragile, beautiful aspects of history I love, and I try to bring that into kind of the modern day as much as I could. So yeah. And I also wanted to touch upon the fact that another criticism that traditional poetry receives is that because of the rhyme, sometimes it ends up sounding cheesy, right? And I completely understand that, actually, because I've read poetry that is rhyming words that is very stereotypical to be rhymed, or um, you know, that does end up sounding a little bit mother goosey, which so I understand that criticism a lot. And of course, when I was younger, I wrote poetry like that myself. And nowadays I try to be a little more keen on having that eye and straining for that. I don't know if I succeed, but I try to be a little more critical of myself nowadays and challenge myself not to sound like Mother Goose, obviously. Try to bring an element of maturity into the poetry, even though it has rhythm and rhyme in it. But I understand that criticism. So I feel like, but I feel like you shouldn't abandon something just because there is the fear of actually, you know, not being able to reach a certain level and fear of sounding cheesy. I feel like, well, you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You kind of have to learn not to sound cheesy and up your poetry level and learn from your past mistakes. And really, that just comes with age, reading more poetry, prose, and criticism from strangers is best, because your loved ones are always going to be proud of everything you write, pretty much. So I think that, you know, you just have to be honest with yourself and allow strangers to look at your work and allow them to tell you. I mean, one of the best things I've ever done when I was in college is she was a friend of mine, but she was really, you know, she was studying English and philosophy, and she was great. She read a lot of poetry, a lot of literature in general, and she was really able to hone in gently, but still very honestly tell me, like, this sounds very, it's just too stereotyping rhythm and rhyme, and there's this cheese element to it. So I had to really learn from that and up my entire game plan of writing. So yeah, I think that it's important to be honest with yourself when you do write poetry. So let me know if you guys have any questions, of course, and if you have any experiences with free verse poetry or traditional poetry, and what poetry you prefer to write or to read. Let me know in the comments down below. I am going to create another episode on how to avoid sounding cheesy in traditional poetry. And until then, if you guys, of course, like I said, have any comments, questions, let me know. Leave them in the comments below. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.